We're gonna echo, 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 and create a design that's elegant and gorgeous for our quilts. Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the next video in the Mastering Swirls Free Motion Challenge video series. We're learning the ins and outs of machine quilting my favorite design, Swirls. Be sure to check out all the exclusive products I put together for this free video series, including this fabric panel, optional borders, and even a coordinating thread collection. To learn more about all of those, just click the link in the description box below, or you can visit quiltingismytherapy.com. And in this video, we're learning the swirl chain. The swirl chain design is so fast and fun to quilt once you get the hang of it. It not only adds an elegant look to your quilt, it's the perfect design for drawing your attention to different areas of your quilts. I love this design so much, I've talked about it in several prior video tutorials, but it's definitely one that's worth learning. So if you're watching and you're thinking, no way, that's too difficult, I could never do that, stick around because I think you're gonna love this design as much as I do. Not only am I gonna show you how it goes together, I'm gonna demonstrate how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm, then I'm gonna show you how to pick the designs you quilt around your swirl chain. And if you've tried and tried to get this design and still can't quite nail it, don't be discouraged. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel, we're gonna use some swirl chain training wheels to make the quilting process even easier. So let's get to it. The swirl chain design consists just of two steps, swirl and echo. But don't let that fool you. It is such an elegant looking design when it all comes together. To quilt this design, I'm going to start by quilting an elongated swirl, very similar to the design that we learned during week 2. Then, once I've quilted that initial swirl, I'm going to echo, echo, echo. I'm using the echoing to build up that shape and help it grow. It doesn't matter how many times you echo the swirl. The main thing is that I want to end on the opposite side from the way the swirl is facing. So for instance, this swirl faces to the left, so I want to end so that I'm on the opposite side. If I find that I'm not in the right spot, I'm just going to use echoing to get there. Then once I'm there, I'm going to quilt my next swirl by extending out in front of the previous one and quilting that swirl so that it faces the opposite direction. Extending it out in front is what helps the swirl chain progress, and quilting them so they face opposite directions is what helps them fit together. Once I have that swirl, I'm going to echo, 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 but I still want to end up on the opposite side of the swirl. One thing that might help you remember this is where those two swirls face away from each other, it kind of creates a V shape, and the V is where you want to be. If I find myself on the other side of the swirl or at the bottom or who knows where, I'm just going to use echoing to get back to that V. Then from that point, I'm going to repeat, quilting another swirl that extends out in front, faces the opposite direction, and then echo, echo, echo. Even though this design is quilted in sections, once I'm finished, it looks like one cohesive chain, which I just love. Now the hardest thing about this design is trusting that it's going to look fine when you're done. Once we're finished quilting that whole swirl chain, we're going to come back and add some filler around it. So if you're not loving how yours is looking, don't worry. We're going to keep putting more stuff around it until it looks good. Now, even though I'm quilting my swirls out in front of each other, at any point I can add some more echoing if I feel like a swirl is too small or if I just want to build it up a little bit more, but that's completely optional. Then, adding my next swirl, going out in front and facing the opposite direction. If you're new to quilting this design, I have a couple tips that you might find helpful. First of all, try to keep the spacing between the lines consistent. I know you've heard that about 1,000,000 times throughout this video series, but it's so important. Look ahead of the needle and trust your hands to take you there. If you're quilting this design on a sewing machine, quilt that swirl chain in the direction that's most comfortable for you. For instance, I prefer quilting in a vertical motion since I can use my whole body to kind of push and pull the quilt. One of the downsides to that though is I'm not always able to see where I'm going, so you might find it easier to work horizontally. It really doesn't matter, just find which works best for you and go for it. And just like we saw with the elongated swirls, the size of the swirl isn't what determines the density, it's the spacing between the lines. So quilt that initial swirl in the size that's comfortable for you. Your swirl chain might have more swirls or less, but as long as the spacing between the lines is consistent, it's gonna look perfect. And what's really fun about this design is once you get the hang of it, it goes together so quickly. Now there's no touching or traveling with this design, so as my foot approaches a previously quilted line, I know it's time to change directions and move on. Now let me show you a couple of common frustrations that some quilters might face. That curve just really helps those swirls kind of hook into each other and gives it that nice, elegant, curvy look. Quilting that first elongated swirl so that it's more straight isn't going to be wrong necessarily, it's just not going to give it that nice curvy look. So as you're quilting that swirl chain, try to really focus on making that first line nice and curvy. Well, now that we've seen kind of how the design goes together, let's look at how we're going to quilt it on the custom panel I designed just for the challenge. Now, just as we saw in the last video, I've also incorporated design elements that you can quilt right along the top of. Think of it like training wheels for quilters. Being able to quilt right over the lines will help you get the hang of how the design goes together. So I'm going to show you what that looks like on a long arm quilting machine. I'm going to start by quilting along the middle line of the swirl chain. Just like we saw in the last video tutorial, being able to quilt along the lines of the design just helps you get the hang of how it goes together. I'm looking ahead of the needle, and I'm not stressing out if the quilting isn't perfectly on the line. Remember, this panel is a great way for us to practice these designs, so don't let your fear of perfection keep you from learning how to do this design. And whether you're quilting it on a sewing machine or a long arm quilting machine, if you get to a point where you're not sure where to go next, just stop. Use your finger to trace out the next couple of steps, and then continue on. Even if the idea of adding a lot of echo lines around a swirl is a little scary, this design is so easy once you get the hang of it. So if you're struggling with it, don't get discouraged. Keep after it, because this is definitely a great design to know how to use on your quilts. Believe it or not, what you put around your swirl chain is just as important as the swirl chain itself. Once I've quilted that elegant swirl chain, I need to fill in the space around it. It's at this point that I can use the quilting to build up that swirl chain, to add some details, or use the filler to help show it off or hide it. If I've quilted it and I feel like, ooh, it needs to be a little bit bigger, I can add some more echo lines around both sides to really build that up. I can echo all the way down one side and back up the other, or I can strategically echo certain areas to build them up. To give this swirl chain an even more custom, elegant look, I can throw in some extra leaves and feathers. It really just depends on the look I'm going for and how much I want to show off that swirl chain. I just love how adding some echo lines and some other little details makes it look way more difficult than it actually is. Once I'm finished echoing the swirl chain and adding any little elements I want to add, it's time to use the fillers to either highlight it or hide it. If I've decided that I love my swirl chain, that it looks great, I really want it to be more of a focal element of the quilt, I'm simply going to use a filler around it that has a lot of contrast. For instance, quilting a design that is a different direction, a different density, or a different shape is what's really going to help highlight that. Anything different enough that will help it stand out. Matchstick quilting is always a great option because it's a different direction than the swirl chain, a slightly different shape. It's a little bit more straight than curved. Plus, by having a denser design around it is really going to help make that swirl chain pop out. Since I'm quilting this filler so densely, it's definitely going to take a little bit longer to quilt. I'm definitely going to make sure that I'm quilting this in areas that I want to show off that swirl chain or for somebody that I really love. I totally understand if the idea of quilting dense back and forth lines doesn't sound like any fun. You can still get the same effect by quilting any filler around it more densely than the design itself. Try pebbles or swirls or really any design as long as you quilt it more densely than the swirl chain itself. Quilting that dense filler around the swirl chain is what's really going to help show it off and make it stand out. But there are times that I don't want the swirl chain to be such a focal point. Maybe I just want a little bit of a subtle look, or maybe I've quilted it and I don't super love how it turned out. If that's the case, I'm going to put a filler around it that's similar to the design itself. So since we have swirls in the swirl chain, I'm just going to quilt more swirls around it, filling in all those areas. The trick is that I'm going to keep the spacing between the lines of the filler the same as the design itself. Now I know that the thought of this is super scary. If you've just quilted your swirl chain and you don't love it, and I'm asking you to put more stuff around it, you might be sitting there thinking I'm a little crazy. But I promise, keep going, keep filling in that area, it's going to look fine when you're done. Just be sure to keep the filler that you put around it similar to the design itself, and it's all going to blend together. And as I continue quilting that filler around the swirl chain, it starts to blend in and just have a nice curvy texture. So whether you keep your swirl chain a little more subtle by filling around it with similar designs, or you decide to make it really stand out with a denser filler, it's gonna look great on your quilts. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the video series, go ahead and fill the area highlighted in red. You can quilt along the lines of the swirl chain and then fill in around them with the filler of your choice. And remember, what you put around the design is just as important as the design itself. And as always, I have free downloadable quilting diagrams, so be sure to click the link in the description box below. You can download those and learn how the design goes together. And if you've watched the previous videos, you know I've put together an expanded resource PDF that has even more tips and suggestions. So to find out more about both of those, just click the link in the description box below or go visit quiltingismytherapy.com. Well, I can't believe we have made it this far in the video series. It's just flying by. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to create the swirl scroll design. This design is elegant and beautiful without all those echo lines. So until then, everybody, happy quilting.